There is a serene and blessed mood in which the emotions lead us gently on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood is almost suspended, so that in the body we are almost laid asleep, but in the mind made quiet by the power of this harmony, by the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Those lines were written by William Wordsworth in 1798. They come from the poem Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey. The title of my talk is the somewhat unclear title, Spiritual Emotions. This talk came about in the following way. A little less than a year ago, we were planning this conference, and the focus of the conference was decided to be medicine and science and their relationship to Vipassana meditation. So the focus of the other speakers and the general focus of the conference was intended to be highlighting the rational, logical, empirical, scientifically compatible aspects of Vipassana meditation. But we felt that if we focused only on that, there might be a distortion, as if Vipassana were strictly a rational or intellectual or exercise in logic. So we wanted to balance out the program with emphasis or re-emphasis on the spirituality of Vipassana. So we're starting with the spiritual reminder, and we'll move on to more scientific and empirical topics throughout the conference. I accepted the assignment to do a talk on the spiritual aspects of Vipassana, and I just gave it the title Spiritual Emotions before I really knew what I meant by that. And then this winter I had the good fortune to be able to go to India and meditate at our main meditation center for Vipassana under the guidance of Mr. Goenka at Dhammagiri. And while I was meditating at Dhammagiri, this talk more or less just crystallized in my mind. And so the rest of the talk that I'm giving today is about Vipassana meditation, but also sprung up out of Vipassana. The particular foci I'm going to use and the particular images I'm going to use all just are products of my Vipassana meditation also. Vipassana is based upon an extremely simple idea. It's like Einstein's great breakthrough in science. The entire equation is just less than an inch long. So part of the measure of truth is always its comprehensibility and simplicity. Vipassana is based upon a very simple idea, which is do what helps others. Don't do what hurts others, and purify your own heart and mind. So those first two phrases are clearly about ethical conduct, and the third phrase is about the mental and emotional life, purification of the heart and mind. The Buddha's ideas are startlingly simple: to do what makes you feel your life is a better life, and to not do what makes you feel your life is a worse life, and to give you a tool to make that discernment as to what really leads to happiness, what really does not lead to happiness. In the Buddha's teaching, there is a large category of emotions that are considered positive or beneficial for human emotional life. And for those of you who are already, and many of you, of course, are already students of Vipassana, by the term spiritual emotions, I mean those aspects that we study under the terms the paramis, the virtues, the bala, the friends, and the bojjhanga, the enlightenment factors. And since those are all foreign terms, I coalesce them into what I hoped was an English language equivalent, spiritual emotions, those emotions which are positive or helpful on the path of Vipassana. The Buddha's lists of negative emotions are extremely short. Those emotions which are harmful on the path, there's just a handful. Hatred, ill will, passion, fear. So there's a long list of positive emotions, a short list of harmful emotions. I start with this because if you have the opportunity to talk to students while they're taking their first meditation course, if you're conducting meditation courses, there are many very small, specific questions about details of technique, but the commonest big question, particularly among young adults just starting out on the practice, the commonest concern, the commonest question is, does this mean I'm not supposed to have emotions? Somehow there's a confusion between the concepts of harmony or equanimity and the absence of emotion. In Wordsworth's poem, Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey, he talks about a serene and blessed mood in which the emotions lead us gently on. So the fear that many people have, and maybe it's a Western cultural stereotype that we find repeating in our students who take Vipassana courses, is the fear that equanimity, serenity, is the same thing as what psychiatrists call flat affect, having no emotions, not being involved in life, not caring. Frequently people ask, does the Vipassana mean I'm not supposed to care about things, or I'm not supposed to love my family? I mean, it should be intuitively obvious that the answer is no, but this is a key point that we want to balance out by using the term spiritual emotions and talking about the spiritual life. So while I was meditating, I decided that the focus of the talk, if there's one thing I want to focus on, say the topic sentence of this talk is, Vipassana is a meditation practice that deepens human emotional life. By practicing Vipassana, your emotions should become deeper, not shallower. Instead of flattened affect, you should have deeper affect. But some emotions should certainly be diminished, and almost anybody, I would say absolutely everybody who practices Vipassana finds a automatic diminution of some emotions, such as hatred, ill will, and fear. So while some emotions decrease, mostly there's an increase, and the cultivation of a rich emotional life is a core aspect of Vipassana practice. And that's the main idea, and everything else I say will just be an embellishment or an addition or an example of that thesis. Two other points that go as corollaries to the main thesis that Vipassana deepens our emotional life. If Vipassana deals with common human emotions, if it deepens our capacity for love, compassion, goodwill, generosity, then Vipassana is universal. It's just operating upon the human stuff. All human beings have hatred. All human beings have compassion. No one is absolutely free from either of those. So if Vipassana is decreasing our hatred and increasing our compassion, if Vipassana is decreasing our fear and increasing our loving kindness, then its action is simply a universal psychological action. In this way, it's empirical, that is to say, it's just working with the human stuff in a pragmatic way. And it's also non-sectarian. It has nothing to do with any boundary between any ethnic group or any religion. That's the starting point, I think, when we look around the world today and see how Vipassana has spread under the guidance of Mr. Goenka. That is the key to his capacity to communicate to people from Mongolia, where we now have meditation centers, to Thailand, to Australia, to the United States, to almost every continent in the world today. The key factor is Vipassana helps those emotions that almost all people wish they had more of: love, compassion, goodwill. And it diminishes those emotions that we all wish we had less of. So it's an emotional action of meditation, and it's a universal action that just deals with what we have in common. The phrase "what we have in common" is actually a phrase coined by Martin Buber, a great Jewish philosopher, who looked for, at the core of religion, what we all have in common. The third point, which I will amplify at the end of this talk, but which will be the core of the next 2 days of speakers. The third point is that Vipassana is also unique. Although it's universal, although it simply deals with everything that all people have in common, the common basic emotional life of humanity, still there's a unique, specific, exact, precise practice. Vipassana is not, and I'll come back to this again in a little more detail at the end of the talk, Vipassana is not syncretism, the technical word meaning just smushing everything together. So by using the term spiritual emotions, I'm referring to the virtues, the paramis, the enlightenment factors that the Buddha talked about, which we all have already and which we can augment. And by using the word spiritual, I'm talking about the emotional life. But by using the term spiritual, I'm not talking about the slopping together of all sorts of actions, practices, and ways of being a person. By Vipassana, I will talk a little about, and the rest of our speakers will talk in very refined detail about what makes Vipassana exact, specific, and precise. I want to read an exact paragraph I wrote, which will reorganize what I just said. We could say that Vipassana leads to universal empathy and identification. Empathy and identification are two words that are not generally used in the writing about Vipassana that comes from the early translations of Pali, the language that the Buddha spoke, into English, the language that we're now speaking. So I'm adding in two words that I have found helpful in communicating today: empathy and identification. Empathy means we know that we're feeling what other people feel. And identification means we know that we're like other people. So the increase in empathy and identification is the increase in the emotional life and the universality within Vipassana. For this reason, the fact that we increase our empathy and identification, Vipassana leads us from self-centered emotion that's pointed towards ourself, into outward-going emotion. So negative emotions that the Buddha encourages us to get rid of are those emotions that defend ourselves. They're self-referential. Positive emotions, the spiritual emotions, the paramis, the virtues, are those that refer primarily to others. They're outward going. The classic example is loving kindness. Because of this universal basis for Vipassana, one of the great advantages to me of practicing Vipassana is to see my own spiritual, emotional life reflected in all people that I meet, and also reflected in all human history and in all literature. For the rest of my talk and our time talking together, I'm going to express an excursion through some of the experiences of my mind as I was meditating at Dhammagiri this winter, with the awareness in the back of my mind, well, gee, I have to give this talk at the conference this summer. And really, what are spiritual emotions about? And these are the things that rose up, and to my delight, and I hope to everybody's education and interest, these come from the whole world. There is no country, there is no religion, there is no era of history in which I don't find a kinship or a friend in the written or historical record, because my emotional life is the same as theirs. The most important realization in the Buddhist teaching. So now I'm moving from the key point about spiritual emotions. Now I'm going to move to 3 examples. Each of these examples will be fairly discursive and extended, and hopefully will take you on a experience that's not only about the emotions, but will bring you close to the emotions themselves. The most important emotion that the Buddha focuses on is an emotion for which we have no English language word that's really satisfactory. In the Pali teaching of the Buddha, he focuses his students primarily, number 1, upon realizing the experience of anicca. Anicca is a word with no good English translation. It's translated approximately to mean impermanence, change with time. However, as I'll describe in the end of my talk, and as the other speakers will describe in great detail, anicca has a much more specific meaning than merely change or merely impermanence. But for the start, we'll say the Buddha focuses us upon realizing the feeling, realizing the experience, actually experiencing the constant change and flux of which the material world is composed. As a scientifically trained person, whenever I would hear that in Goenkaji's teaching, or whenever I would read that in the Buddha's teaching, my mind always immediately clicks to all those horrible physics and chemistry courses I had to endure. That taught me that every moment, every particle of the physical world is vibrating and in transformation. That's what the Buddha had in mind. But he had in mind a direct experience of that. This experience is not a Buddhist experience. Occasionally I read books on Buddhism and they say, Buddhism teaches impermanence, which is sort of true, but actually all human beings all the time have at least an inkling, if not a direct realization of impermanence. It's a common human experience. We all have it in common. There's nobody so naive who imagines that their body will live forever, that their body won't change, that their child won't grow up, that they won't get aging, disease, and die. A number of years ago, I wrote an essay called The Experience of Impermanence, in which I quoted various passages of poetry from different great poets that describe their moments of experiencing something like the realization of anicca, the Buddha's emphasized spiritual emotion. Just a few of these passages in brief. One from Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature about 15 years ago. He was a Polish poet who lived through World War II in Poland, which is probably the worst moment on the human plunge. As you know, most of the death camps in World War II were located in Poland. Miłosz then moved to the United States, where he has lived and taught in California, which is, I am told, the closest thing to heaven we get on this planet. And he lived a life of this extreme disjunction between the extreme violence and horror of World War II in Poland and the comfort of being an academic in California in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And this feeling of disjunction is one of the key themes in his poetry, for which he got the Nobel Prize. And in one phrase he says, returning to Lithuania, he's Polish but actually born in Lithuania, he says, "This place, Lithuania and I, though far away from each other, simultaneously, year after year, we are both losing leaves." A poet I'm going to emphasize in this talk, William Butler Yeats, you could say Irish poet, but the British claimed him like almost everything else in Ireland. And so he's considered one of the great British poets of the 20th century, and he has a lot to do with India, and I'll get back to that. But Yeats, of course, won the Nobel Prize also in poetry or in literature. And one of his very beautiful poems, The Wild Swans at Cooley, he talks about a favorite place he likes to walk where there's beautiful woods and a very still pond, and the swans like to paddle along in this pond, and the pond is perfectly still and it reflects these swans, and it's an apparent image of perfect stillness, as if nothing would change. The swans are calm, the water's calm. On a beautiful day in autumn, when he's taking a walk there, the woods are calm. But he, instead of talking about swans in general, he specifically says that there are 9 and 50 swans. Why 9 and 50? Why not 61? Did he actually count? It's quite a few to count. Most critics say that this poem is about, the swans are representatives of Yeats's life, his years. He was actually younger than 59. He wrote the poem in his mid-50s. Say, the approximate number of years of his life. And as he's looking at the stillness of the swans, it's the calmness that he feels. He's happy, he's a famous poet, he's in a beautiful woodland. And yet, that's not the whole picture. And the conclusion of the poem is, he describes, now the swans drift on still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find that they have flown away? The Psalms say, the Psalms in talking to the God that's addressed in the Old Testament, thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, return ye children of men, for 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past. 1,000 years in thy sight are as but a watch in the night. Everybody has this experience of a Nietzsche. As I was meditating in my cell, just these lines came up on my mind. I thought, well, in the English language, Nietzsche is not the experience of constant change, particularly change at the level of one's own body, is not fully described in English. But the best description is, of course, by Shakespeare. Everybody in high school has to read The Tempest. Maybe people remember The Tempest. The Tempest is one of Shakespeare's later plays. The chief character in The Tempest is a duke, a ruler, who's been deposed. His name is Prospero. Many literary critics say that Prospero, among all the characters in the many plays of Shakespeare, Prospero is the one who is closest to Shakespeare himself. The things that Prospero say seem to be expressing Shakespeare more than any other character in the pantheon of Shakespeare's plays. Prospero has been deposed because he spends too much time studying books and magic, and his people are dissatisfied. That's not a practical ruler. And as you may remember in the play The Tempest, a group of people gets stuck on an island by circumstance, and each character in the play The Tempest moves from illusion towards reality, each character in his or her own way. And The Tempest is the play that contains those beautiful lines when Miranda, the daughter of Prospero, discovers that there are other human beings. She's lived alone on this island, just with her father and various spirits. And she says, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." So she moves from the illusion that there's no one else in the world to a world filled with potential friendships and human community. The origin of Huxley's title, Brave New World. Prospero also moves from an obsession with magical power controlling spirits, studying magic books. And through the action of the play, he decides to surrender magic and live in reality. The main plot tension is the plot of Prospero and others discovering that they can and will and must live with reality. And at the end of the play, you may remember, Prospero gives a famous speech, some parts of which he says, "This rough magic I now abjure. I'll break my rod and bury my book." The rod and the book, the magician's staff and the magician's magic book. So he throws away magic to live with reality. And so what is the reality that Prospero finds that he reveals to the other characters in the play, and that literary critics who know Shakespeare well say this speaks for Shakespeare. This is the closest we get to Shakespeare's personal statement of reality or his religious philosophical basis. Prospero reveals this to the other characters in a play within the play, a device everybody remembers from Hamlet also. So a main character puts on a play, and the play exemplifies something about the play. And the play within the play of The Tempest is a play put on by spirits who string up cloth, fabric backdrops on metal racks to produce a background of props. And the props reveal the whole world. There's the prop of the globe, and then the spirits put on a play or a dance. The spirits are under the power of Prospero, and then that play stops. And it stops abruptly, and the other characters in The Tempest, the main play, look concerned. And Prospero says to them, and the first words are very important, "Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now have ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, and the great globe, and all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." Probably, maybe 50-75% of the whole Pali canon, the preservation of the Buddha's teaching in the Pali language, says the exact same thing. It repeats over and over the importance upon experiencing and remembering the reality of insubstantiality. However, in the Buddha's teaching, it always points to a direct experience within one's own body. Goenka always quotes this particular verse from the Dhammapada, which I'll quote only in English. "Impermanent are all compounded things." Compounded things means everything that consists of atoms and molecules. "Impermanent are all compounded things. When one perceives this true insight, one becomes detached from suffering." This is the path of purification. The Buddha was great at simplifying his teaching to one simple aphorism. So this is the path of purification, that when one perceives all things are impermanent, then one becomes detached from suffering. So the first spiritual emotion we discussed is the realization of anicca. We find that we share it in common with poets and playwrights from different cultures and different times. However, there's a specificity to the Buddha's teaching that's slightly different. The second most emphasized thing in the Buddha's teaching, the first most emphasized, is the realization of anicca. And the second most emphasized thing is the raising into consciousness of loving kindness. The Buddha's teaching is very heavily what I call empathic and identificatory. We empathize with other beings. We feel what they feel, and we identify with their plight. The Buddha's teaching for this is pervasive in his discourses, but it's crystallized in a poem, a Pali poem. The Buddha was also a poet, not just a writer or speaker of prose. And the classic formula for his teaching of the experience of loving kindness towards all beings was the Metta Sutta, which is a prose sutta. Sutta is sometimes translated as discourse, but it's actually a teaching because the discourses are sometimes poetry. And in the Metta Sutta, the Buddha says, whatever breathing things there may be, no matter whether they are frail or firm, with none excepted, whether they're long or short, whether they're small or tall, whether they're thick, whether they're seen, whether they're unseen, wherever they're dwelling, near or far, whether they exist already, or even if they're only just seeking to exist, may all these creatures be happy. May they all have a blissful heart. And just as might a mother, with her life, protect the son that was her only child, so let us, for every living thing, maintain unbounded consciousness and being, and with love for all the world, above, below, everywhere. Just a few things about that poem stand out. One is that key image, which is actually repeated wherever you see the Buddha's teaching repeated, that towards all being we should feel as if each one of them is our only child. What an extraordinarily powerful image that is. The other is I want to return to this line where it says, he's talking about all beings, and he says whether they're short or tall or thick. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but in my life I deal with all kinds of insurance companies, and in my daily life I find many people who are thick. So I think the Buddha is giving me a good reminder to send my loving kindness towards those I encounter who are thick. When I think of the practice of loving kindness, and when I look around the world for someone who is not a member of a Buddhist religion, who is not taking the Buddha's teaching and organizing it into an organized religion, but who is just practicing the way that the Buddha taught, often my mind goes to John Muir, famous American writer and naturalist. And I wrote about John Muir in Cultivating Inner Peace, and I'm just going to take 5 or 10 minutes to tell you about John Muir with a particular focus on the aspect of cultivating loving kindness. Muir's story is extremely interesting. He wrote about himself, so we have a lot of biographical information, and many people have written about him. He was a recent historical figure, and there was loads of information about his life. His life starts off in a manner that's incredibly horrible. His father was a member of the Scotch military. They had a very strong concern with being tough. And then his father left the military and joined a fundamentalist religious cult. And this cult started in Scotland and then moved to the backwoods of the United States. In those days, and actually we still have cults like this today, there are people who seek out the United States of America and the backwoods of the United States to pursue what they feel is freedom, but which to everyone else looks like some extreme form of fanaticism. Somehow in America, people thought and think you can do that. So his father was a member of a fanatical cult that moved to the most remote part of the settled United States. This would be before the Civil War, so the Great Plains still had no people living on it. The Great Plains were open and had native people, and the European settlements extended as far as Wisconsin. So John Muir's father took them to Wisconsin. John was about a child at that point, so he did have some memories of Scotland, had grown up in Scotland, but he was still a boy when he arrived in the backwoods of Wisconsin. And they proceeded to live a life of poverty, isolation, and extreme cruelty. The behavior that his father exhibited is unbelievable. If you read about it, you just can't believe a human being is perpetrating this upon any living thing, not to mention his own children, all his children. But John Muir was the oldest. He was an extremely vigorous, robust child, and so he seemed to receive the worst of it. They were whipped every day. There was no reason. not to be whipped. They were whipped every day. John Muir, who had a great sense of humor, later wrote, he said, "My father seemed to believe that irritating the skin stimulated the mind." But there were special forms of punishment and beatings and torture. At one point, John Muir was sent down a well to help clear out a well. The well had poisonous gases in it. He complained. His father refused to haul him out, and he basically died, but was revived just in the nick of time. So now, I think it's common knowledge today, one of the major discoveries of our time in psychiatry is that when you find an extremely cruel person, almost certainly they themselves were treated extremely cruelly. So we don't have the data on John Muir's father's background, but unlikely he was well treated as a child. And there's a great psychiatrist, an older woman at this point, Dorothy Lewis, who's been doing studies of death row inmates in the United States. And of course, as you all know, we in Vipassana have a strong interest in reaching out to prisons. And Dorothy Lewis has showed that if you study the lives of death row inmates, that is, people who've committed significant violence and direct interpersonal murder, 100% have been abused in childhood and have had head trauma from the abuse. Now, Johnny Muir had the equivalent of head trauma. He was unconscious and seriously unconscious, almost dead, almost brain dead. So you would predict from this story, if you were a psychiatrist, you would predict that John Muir will turn out to be a sadist who's going to abuse his children and hate everybody and treat everybody the way he was treated. And the wonderful thing about human life is that it is not totally predictable. It always remains somewhat mysterious and incomprehensible. And Johnny Muir turned out to be the exact opposite. From his earliest days, he showed a great concern with compassion. You might imagine he's saying, don't do what was done to me. Let's everybody treat everybody differently. One of the quaint parts of his story, which was very interesting to me and will be to those of you who remember the Vietnam War experience in the United States. In the 1860s, when John Muir was a young man at the University of Wisconsin, the Civil War broke out. And the Civil War, in the way history books are written, it's this glorious thing, and it's fabulous heroism and stuff. But actually, it was the bloodiest war ever fought by human beings. The reason was there had been a tremendous advance in military technology, specifically the Gatling gun, which could fire rounds of ammunition very rapidly, unlike muskets and rifles. So people were being killed by the hundreds of thousands. And our American hero Abraham Lincoln invented the draft. Before the Civil War, there were no such thing as a draft. There were two ways you raised an army all over the world. One is you asked for volunteers, and lots of people like to join armies. And the other is you conscripted people. Conscription is a fancy word for enslaving people. You just take them and make them fight. Lincoln was too advanced to conscript people. This is a free country. You cannot conscript people. He started a draft. Since we had voter registration back then, since people were registered to vote, you take the voter registration, and men of a certain age have to go and fight in the Civil War. John Muir was of that age. He was at the University of Wisconsin. This goes back to all of us who were in college during Vietnam. And he started the great American counter movement. He went to Canada. When the war was over, Muir returned from Canada and began a life which is quite amazing in its own right. Among other things, John Muir was a mechanical genius at a level that we can't account for. No one else in his family had such talent. As a farm boy on his father's farm, and this was the place where he was being so vilely treated, he took a bunch of farm tools and invented a machine that was so sensitive to changes in temperature that if a human being walked in front of this machine, it would register the change in temperature. Now, we have that today, like you have lighting behind your garage, and if you break a beam of light, the light goes on, something like that. But this was done with farm tools about 1850. He showed this machine at rural fairs in Wisconsin, and that's how he got to the University of Wisconsin. Obviously, he had no money, no education. He'd never gone to school because his father wouldn't allow them to go to school. But when this machine was shown in the fairs of the Wisconsin State Fair, he was given a scholarship to the University of Wisconsin. After the Civil War, when he returned from Canada to the United States, he was made you could say like a foreman in a factory, a chief development officer, we would say today. So he was the equivalent of a SiliconValley.com entrepreneurial. He was absolutely destined for wealth and fame. In fact, he was already, as a very young man, wealthy and famous, developing various sorts of agricultural implements. And one day he was working late in those days. This would be about 1870, no electricity. So he's working by candlelight or kerosene light, and he's working with an awl, a point, and he was leaning over something, and the awl slipped and went into his eye. And there's a phenomena called sympathetic blindness. If one eye is traumatized, the other eye also stops functioning. So he actually went instantly blind, even though one eye had not been harmed. He was totally blind. And in that second, he thought, now my eyes are closed forever on all of God's beauty. He was raised as a fundamentalist Christian. And he felt that his entire life, all his fame, all his fortune, all his Silicon Valley equivalent destiny was a waste of time. But he was blind. There was nothing to do. But fortunately, the awl had actually punctured the aqueous, which is just the large circle of fluid behind the actual optical equipment of the eye. Within a week, his sight was restored. No treatment was necessary. And he changed his entire life. He became the most important thing in life. And many of you aspire to the same thing. He became a bum. He started a journal. And on his journal, he wrote, my address is Planet Earth within the cosmos. That was his mailing address. It reminds me of my son's current email address. The rest of his story remains equally remarkable. He was a hobo and a sheep herder and a logger for many years doing basic menial labor. At the same time, he went out to the Sierra Nevada, where Yosemite is located, and he started on his own, without any further education, without any colleagues, without any books. He started geological investigations of the Sierra Nevada. John Muir was one of the most famous geologists of the 19th century. Aside from all the other things he did, he was a geologist. He proved the theory of mountain glaciation. So we had the theory of continental glaciation, but the Sierra Nevada were clearly not part of the landmass that had been glaciated by continental glaciers. He showed how mountain glaciers had carved the Sierra Nevada. He showed how mountain glaciers had carved Yosemite. He wrote scientific papers. He was appointed as a faculty member to the Boston Academy of Sciences and to Harvard University. He rejected the appointments. Of course, he was very talented, so he really didn't need ordinary livelihood. He was almost instantly a very successful writer. His books, he must have 20 books in print today. He's been dead for almost a century. And as probably everybody knows, his most famous achievements were to become what is called father of the conservation movement. And I bring us up to that point because although Muir was a conservationist, which is a political thing, and he was a political person, he was by no means a backwoodsman. He was a very astute and competent politician. He knew the powerful people in Washington. When Teddy Roosevelt created the national park system as we know it today, John Muir was his consultant. So he was a very worldly, pragmatic, and competent person, as well as a remarkable backwoodsman and outdoorsman. But the reason I bring him to our attention was that he was not merely interested in conserving parks, conserving trees, things we call conservation. He had a pervasive, unbroken attitude of the attempt to establish harmony and loving kindness with all things all the time. Even his political enemies noticed this. His mode of political discourse was a mode of vigorous opposition with civility and cordiality. He was concerned with the well-being of every plant and animal, and also things that we mostly in Western biology were taught that are not living, but he considered living. He felt that the rocks could sing to him. He was very not psychotic. This is a very practical, competent writer, politician. He actually, in his later life, he owned a farm and an orchard, which was very successful. Alive to the life of everything. I used the terms earlier: empathy, feeling what others feel, and identification, feeling others are like himself. Actually, the conservation movement has yet to catch up with Johnny Muir. There's a quote I like very much from him, which captures this feeling. There are many, many, many quotes. He wrote many books, and they're filled with this love of all beings and the sense of harmony among himself and all things. But he liked a lot of things that the rest of us find hard to like. There's a passage in which he describes rats as his good companions around the campfire. But there's a passage about lizards, which I like, and I'll read as our conclusion to Johnny Muir's feeling of metta, feeling of loving kindness for all things. And this story, we have to go back into his childhood. When he was living in a farm in Wisconsin, among other difficulties that he faced was there was no clothing, there were no stores, there was no place to buy stores, there was no cash anyway. And the clothing was just either fibers like cotton and animal fibers like wool that were woven into homespun. Homespun sounds cozy, but it's very rough and coarse and oily and so forth. And yet Johnny had grown up in Scotland, and there then as now, British wool, was number one in the world. British tailoring was number one in the world. So it was a very humiliating, class-conscious deprivation to have no tailored clothes. And a big thing for John Muir when he did become wealthy and famous, which he did become, tailored clothes. And as a very quaint footnote, John Muir was the guy who popularized Levi's jeans. That's a true story. But anyway, this is what he says about... So here's a guy who grew up very concerned with tailored clothes. This is what he says about lizards. He says, "Lizards are my small fellow mortals, gentle and guileless. They are easily tamed and have beautiful eyes expressing the clearest innocence. And they will teach you that scales may cover as fine a nature as hair or feathers or anything tailored." I comment more in Cultivating Inner Peace that when I've looked at what John Muir was doing, the question is, why did this man get so filled with metta, with loving kindness, with identification, with empathy, with compassion for everything? How did that come about? Is it just a reaction to the cruelty? Maybe. But another very interesting thing about John Muir was the descriptions he gives of what he did when he was doing his mountain climbing in the Sierras and later in Alaska. And there's some very striking descriptions that to me sound as if John Muir had spontaneously discovered Vipassana meditation. I've written that up, so I'm not going to go into more details, but it was taught in the Buddha's day and surely must be true. Since Vipassana is based on universal practices, there are going to be people who come up with it just spontaneously, observing the sensations of their body, trying to remain equanimous with them, not judging them, observing them objectively, and springing free of the suffering that comes from attachment to the bodily self. So John Muir gives some descriptions that are uncannily like Vipassana, and it's my personal fantasy or belief that John Muir actually developed his metta, his loving kindness, by practicing Vipassana in an untutored way. Something I've commented on in other public talks, so some of you have heard it, but the Buddha taught to many different people and many different ways. So we find through the Pali Canon many different levels of teaching. Sometimes the things seem to contradict, but if you reread them, you find, well, the audience the Buddha was teaching to in this talk was different than this other audience. The Buddha did teach morality. Morality means don't hurt others. That's morality. But the Buddha also taught empathy and identification. It's not just a moral position, like don't do that. It's a teaching like these are just like us. We identify with them. Why would we hurt them? And there's a little udana. Udanas are the short discourses of the Buddha, hardly a few words long. And one of my favorite ones is the Buddha's walking along and some kids are pounding a snake with a stick. And in India, snakes are very fearful. There are many poisonous snakes. People are naturally afraid of them, and it's understandable that they attack them. And the Buddha does not say to these boys, don't harm a snake, I teach non-harmfulness. If you hurt others in your next life, you'll be punished. He doesn't say that. What he says is, why are you harming other beings that just want to be happy? That's empathy and identification. That's the teaching of metta from the Buddha. And in one of the quaintest teachings of metta by the Buddha, he says, the meditator holds himself aloof from causing injury to seeds or plants. So we've gone through two spiritual emotions, the realization of impermanence and the practice of loving kindness. And now on to a third. Devotion and friendship. I wanted to focus this talk on the key emotional aspects of the Buddha's teaching. The first is the realization of impermanence. The second is the practice of loving kindness. And to me, the third is friendship and devotion. These spring naturally out of the practice of metta. But obviously, when John Muir says wood rats or lizards are his friends, there's a metaphor. And our true friends are people. And love and devotion to people is a key part of the Buddha's teaching. I had an interesting experience. I looked up friendship in the back of a whole bunch of books I have about Buddhism and the Buddhist suttas and all that. It was not indexed in any book. That's a very unusual distortion about how the Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, when it's turned into Buddhism, is being brought into the Western world. There are certain errors in the texts. When I think about devotion and friendship, the story that rose up in my mind is the relationship between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. This is a story that just captures qualities that I wish I had, most of us wish we had. Gandhi, everybody has some image of him. He was born about 1860 in India. Most people's views of Gandhi are based upon the Attenborough movie, which is a very good historical reconstruction, but of course very brief. Can't capture the whole man's life. So Gandhi did not live most of his life in India. Very important feature of Gandhi. As a very young man, we'd say a teenager, he went to Britain and studied law. It took a long time for him to get through his legal studies, so he was in his 20s when he became a barrister in London, and then he left England. He did visit India, only briefly, and then he spent almost all of his mature adult years in South Africa, where he became a freedom fighter for what was to become apartheid, against apartheid. It wasn't called apartheid then. And working for the Indian community, civil rights of the Indian community. It was there he developed his techniques of nonviolent political activity. And it was only when he was already a mature middle-aged adult that he returned to India. And when he returned to India, he did not know India, and he did not understand Indian people and Indian culture because he'd spent his whole life as an exile living in foreign countries. His actual main identification was as a subject of the British Commonwealth. He was very British identified. He was a barrister in the British legal system, been to school in London. And the famous quote that's in the Richard Attenborough movie, which is a true quote found a number of times in Gandhi's writing, he says, I am not any one culture. I'm a Hindu, I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew, I'm a Muslim. And that's because Gandhi did study Christianity in England. He was a scholar of the New Testament. Most of his friends in the freedom struggle in South Africa were Jewish, so he had studied the Old Testament with them. The original people who had called him to come from England to South Africa to help them in the Indian community were Muslims, so he had very close ties with the Muslim community in South Africa. And he did have a Hindu background. And in South Africa, he became a student of the Bhagavad Gita and remained so the rest of his life. So he was actually of all those religions. That's not just a metaphor. When he came to India, he knew it was his calling to get involved in the political life of India, but he didn't know a thing about India. So he had to first station himself where there could be someone who could teach him about India, let him know, what is India really about? The person he picked was Rabindranath Tagore. So Gandhi came with his ashram and initially stayed at the ashram of Rabindranath Tagore, which was called Shanti Niketan, a elementary school near Calcutta. It's still there. Now, who was Rabindranath Tagore? Tagore was about 8 or 9 years older than Gandhi, also born in the 1860s. And so by the time we're talking about, the time roughly of World War I, Tagore, also a man in his late 40s or early 50s. And he was the most prominent person in India. And the reason was as follows. Tagore came from a very prominent family, very wealthy people, very educated people. His father was a great spiritual teacher, wrote many important spiritual books in Bengali, and was called the Maharishi of Bengal. Tagore's older brother was the first Indian that the British allowed into the British civil service. The British actually ruled through the civil service, appointing Britishers to rule other countries. And Tagore's older brother was the first person to break that ethnic, racial, religious barrier and become so-called Britisher in the British civil service. Shows the stature, the intelligence, the drive of the Tagore family. So naturally, as you might imagine, as Tagore was growing up, he was totally incorrigible. They could not keep him in school. They sent him to the finest schools in the world. Ultimately, they sent him to London to study with the law, as Gandhi was going to do a little later. Wouldn't study. But he really didn't need to study, because by the time he was a teenager, he had already been proclaimed the Shakespeare of Bengali language. He actually wrote under a pseudonym. He wrote some religious poetry under a pseudonym. And this poetry was put forward as ancient texts that had been discovered. And various Bengali critics said, we have now found the true, hidden, and missing Shakespeare of Bengal. But it turned out to be this teenage boy. From his teenage years onward, Tagore was a very famous and successful writer, but only in the Bengali language. No one outside of Bengal heard of him. Even in India, he was unknown, because Bengali is just one of many major languages in India. But he was very successful in Bengal, but he refused to write in English, which he knew impeccably, because English was the language of the rulers, and he wanted to write in the language of the people. One of Tagore's pride was that his poetry should be understandable by the most elite intellectuals, but also by illiterate peasants. Somehow in his early 50s, Tagore was seized with a fervor that he couldn't account for. It changed his whole thinking, and he had no rational basis for it. He wrote a book of song lyrics called Gitanjali. Tagore was a playwright, a novelist, a short story writer, a poet, but he was primarily a songwriter. So most of his poetry actually started out as song lyrics or songs. He wrote the words and music both. And somehow in his early 50s, he took a reversal on his life commitment to never write in English. And instead, he translated his poems into English while taking a boat to England. When he got to England, he had some few contacts with British intellectuals. He showed them this book, and they were stunned. They took it to William Butler Yeats, who we came upon earlier. Yeats had not yet won the Nobel Prize, but was the preeminent poet of the English language. And I'll read you a few passages of what Yeats said about Tagore's translation of Gitanjali. This is William Butler Yeats' introduction. The introduction, by the way, is still intact. If you buy Gitanjali today, this introduction, almost 100 years old, is still there. I have carried the manuscript of these translations about with me for days, reading it in railway trains or on the tops of buses, and I've often had to close it, lest some stranger would see how much it moved me. These poems display a world I have dreamed of all my life long. They are the work of a supreme culture, as common as the grass. yet a tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing, having passed through the centuries, gathering from both the learned and the unlearned. And Yeats continues, "It is as if for the first time I have met my own image. Perhaps for the first time in literature I have heard my own voice as if in a dream." Pretty strong words. If you get an introduction like that from William Butler Yeats, the next thing that happens to you, 1 year later, Tagore got the Nobel Prize for Gitanjali. And that was extremely important, world revolutionary, because Tagore was a Indian, meaning a subject people. He was not actually a free citizen of the world. The Nobel Prize had never been given to anybody but a white European-derived person. First break in that was Rabindranath Tagore. So when Gandhi arrived in India, about the time of the First World War, Tagore had rocketed to fame and was what Gandhi called the sentinel of Asia. Asia. All Asians identified with Tagore's success, not just Indians, Japanese, Chinese. All the people of Asia said, at last an Asian literary figure has been recognized as an equal to, a master of world literature. So Gandhi sat at the feet of Tagore, and for about 20 years they maintained a literary relationship. Gandhi moved back to Gujarat on the other side of India. And almost all the relationship was querulous and contentious. These guys were constantly at odds. Gandhi was a political activist who wanted to shake things up, who started major social and political movements. He chastised Tagore. He said, the only poem that the people of India really need is food. Tagore was an educator, a literary man. He felt that to change a society, you should change elementary education. His focus was on educating children. The heart of his life was the school Shanti Niketan. He took the money from the Nobel Prize and gave it all to his school. This moves up to 1932 in a very important event which also impacts upon the development and rise of Dhamma and the Buddha's teaching in the world. In 1932, Gandhi was in prison for a previous civil rights action. When Gandhi was in prison, he felt like he was in a temple. It was the only time in his life he got away from all this hubbub and activity, and he was free to think and write. He wrote a book in that prison called The Temple of Prison. So imagine today, I hope they ban email in prisons, give people a little break to think. While Gandhi was in prison, the British were reviewing a plan to give India somewhat more independence. And one of the big sticking points was what to do about untouchables. Gandhi, most important thing in Gandhi's life, much more important than the independence of India from Britain, was the elimination of caste distinction. And an ironic counterplayer to Gandhi was a gentleman called Dr. Ambedkar. Ambedkar was of untouchable descent. His grandfather had joined the British military. The British, of course, didn't care if you were untouchable. His grandfather had a distinguished career. Ambedkar's father had been in the British military, distinguished career. And so when Ambedkar grew up, he had access to education. People noticed this guy's brilliant. He ended up at Columbia Law School here in New York. And then he went back to India and was head of the untouchables in the political struggle for freedom and rights for the untouchables. You would think Gandhi and Ambedkar would be on the same side, both fighting to eliminate untouchables, but actually they were at odds. Gandhi felt that untouchability should be eliminated and untouchables should all become part of the mainstream of Indian life. Ambedkar felt that Hinduism had so abused the untouchables that they needed a separate electorate. That is to say, Ambedkar favored affirmative action, and Gandhi was against affirmative action. In 1932, Ramsay MacDonald, British Prime Minister, said, we're setting up a new government and we're giving affirmative action separate electorate, separate seats, separate votes to the untouchables to protect them under the advice we've gotten from Mr. Ambedkar. They assumed incorrectly that Gandhi would like this as a protection for the untouchables. Gandhi said, this will divide the people of India into separate governments, separate groups. I will fast to the death to stop this. This is very threatening as he was in a British prison. So if he died, he'd die in British hands. Now, Gandhi woke up on the morning in which he had decided he was going to start his fast to the death. At this time, 1932, Gandhi is in his 60s. Tagore is already quite an elderly gentleman in his 70s. Gandhi woke up at 2:30 in the morning. And I like that because I like to read about all these great men who also have insomnia when they're anxious and wake up at 2:30. This is the letter he wrote. Remember, Gandhi has no teacher, he has no guru, he has no spiritual leader, he's not a Hindu, he's not a Muslim, he's just Gandhi. There's no one he can turn to. Is he making a right decision? He's trying to block something that will protect untouchables, but he's for untouchables. Is he making a mistake? Is he wrong? Is he right? Is Ambedkar right? He and Ambedkar have the same goal, and yet Gandhi is going to fast to the death against him. Dear Guru Dev was the honorary term with which everybody addressed the Nobel Prize-winning Tagore. This is early morning, 3 a.m. I enter the fiery gates at noon. Gandhi's fasts induced tremendous physical pain in spite any movie you see where he's lying all peaceful. Actually, he suffered. I enter the fiery gates at noon. If you can bless this effort, I want it. You have been a true friend because you have been a candid friend, often speaking your thoughts aloud. I yet prize your criticism. If your heart condemns my action, I'm not too proud to make an open confession of my blunder. Gandhi once called a strike, national strike, and it became violent. And he called it off, and he said, I have made a Himalayan blunder. Right in public, confessing his crimes. Would not get very far in American politics. So he's saying to Tagore, if you disagree with me, I will make a confession of my blunder, whatever the cost of the confession, if I find myself in error. But if your heart approves of the action, I want your blessing. It will sustain me. Gandhi was too late. I told you, Tagore was quite old. So he couldn't waste time. He had already sent a telegram to to Gandhi, and it says, this is Rabindranath Tagore's telegram to Gandhi. It is worth sacrificing precious life for the sake of India's unity and social integrity. Our sorrowing hearts will follow your sublime penance with reverence and love. The fast started. There was a miscalculation, definitely, on Gandhi's part. He was in his 60s. He was no longer this robust mid-40s activist from South Africa. He started to spike very high spikes of high blood pressure. Ironically, when Gandhi was in prison, he was treated quite royally. He had all kinds of British physicians there, but what do you do? This 60-year-old, he was over 60, in early mid-60s man, not eating, getting high blood pressure, temperature in September in India, broiling hot. Gandhi was definitely heading towards death. The British released Mrs. Gandhi, who was in another prison for civil disobedience, and brought her to his side, hoping that would maybe get him to stop the fast. Now, I don't know, we're supposed to have empathy if we're meditators, so when I imagine what Mrs. Gandhi would say, I imagine her saying something like, it's worth dying for your principles, or you should stop this and live, you're my husband. Instead, she walked into the room. There were many witnesses, all kinds of government officials who were hovering around Gandhi, and she said, the same old story. The actual negotiations required three partners. Gandhi and Ambedkar had to come to some agreement whether the untouchables would have affirmative action or not. And the British had to ratify it. It was actually a British decision. But Ramsay MacDonald was in London, and Gandhi was in Pune. And this is in the heat of Indian summer, September. Anybody who's been in India in September knows it's a really, really life-threatening circumstance just to breathe. After a short number of days, Gandhi gave away his last possessions. He had very few possessions, but he gave them away. And under pressure, all three sides did come to an agreement. Ambedkar agreed that to put limits on certain forms of affirmative action, and Gandhi agreed to accept some seats reserved for untouchables in the Indian parliament that existed under the British. And Ramsay MacDonald ratified it by telegram from England, but Gandhi was already very sick. Now, I have two different accounts. There are many historical accounts of this. And one account is, as soon as the agreement was ratified, Kasturba Gandhi, Mrs. Gandhi, gave Gandhi a drink of orange juice to break his fast. But the other account is, as soon as it was ratified, Gandhi said, I won't take any orange juice until I hear a song of Tagore. Now, as I mentioned, Tagore was very old, and it was India. It was September. And Tagore lived near Calcutta. And this Gandhi's in Pune. It's about a 1,000-mile train trip. And the time is 1932. You can imagine what trains were like. When Gandhi started his fast, Tagore gave a talk to his school, Shanti Niketan, in which he said, an eclipse is happening in India. Then he immediately got on the train and rode 1,000 miles in September to Pune. So by the time Gandhi's fast was broken, Tagore was actually present. Gandhi didn't know he was very sick. First thing that happened, we don't know whether it was the orange juice or the song. Tagore sang Gandhi a song from Gitanjali, the Nobel Prize-winning work. Just a few footnotes to conclude that story. Tagore died about 10 years later, an elderly man, about 80 years old. World War II had already broken out. Gandhi lived through World War II into the partition of India. Gandhi said his life was ruined. India was partitioned into two countries. Gandhi was totally against it. You remember he fasted to the death to keep untouchables within the fold of India. Now the Muslims, to whom he felt very close, were breaking off from India into India and Pakistan. One of the things he did in his grief, we could say Gandhi was not always rational. He walked alone through the areas where there were riots. These riots killed about 1 million people, so they were extremely violent. He walked alone so that no one would know it was Gandhi. If he went with a retinue, they might listen to him because he's Gandhi. He wanted to be listened to because he felt he was speaking the truth. He walked alone through these areas that were being torn up. Why he wasn't killed, no one knows. He was not killed, but he was eventually shot, as everybody knows, by a Hindu. As he was walking alone, people would try to traipse behind him or see what he was doing. He was very, very famous. And it was reported that as he walked alone, he was singing a song by Tagore. The English translation of the words are, if no one will listen to your call, walk on alone. Now, we're talking about emotions that are augmented by Vipassana. We've talked about the realization of impermanence, the empathy, compassion, love and kindness that comes with that, and then the feeling of friendship and devotion, which these two gentlemen exemplify. I want to read a few words from the Buddha in conclusion. The Buddha says, the meditator should live as a person who binds together those who are divided, an encourager of those who are friends, a peacemaker, a lover of peace, delighted in peace, a speaker of words that make for peace. And a very famous quote, which appears everywhere in the Buddha's teaching, there's a discourse in which Ananda is questioning the Buddha, what is the importance of friendship in the holy life? And the Buddha says, it is through having like qualities that beings associate and meet together. And then Ananda says, well, that means that half of this holy life is friendship with the good, companionship with the good. And the Buddha says, no. Do not say that, Ananda. Do not say that. It is the whole of this holy life, this friendship, companionship, and association with the good. A few points in conclusion. We've talked about spiritual emotions, gave 3 examples. How's the time, David?
You're over.
I'm over. Okay. I'll be brief. The final point I want to make is that although Vipassana shares these universal human heart, this spiritual, emotional life with everybody, it has a very specific, exact, precise, definitive teaching that enables an ordinary person to make progress. We can't be like John Muir and Rabindranath Tagore, but we can make progress. But if someone is very developed, then the path also works for them. After all, the Buddha carried this path to Nibbana, Nibbana being something entirely different than anything I've talked about, total purification. So the rest of our speakers will focus on the very exact and specific qualities that makes Vipassana not the same thing, even though it's universal, not the same thing as anything else. I wanted to write a poem. I've given some general poems. I wanted to write a poem that would be more specific to Vipassana. And so this is just some thoughts that make Vipassana specific and unique, and also that capture the spiritual emotion, the positive qualities, the joy that is part of the practice. And in this poem, I'm talking about the pagoda at Dhammagiri, where I was meditating. Many people here have meditated. And I also speak to the pagoda as if it's my friend. The pagoda is the hub of the eternal experiment of life shedding its separateness and opening unreservedly to love and equanimity. Each pagoda cell provides full privacy, yet all face center where the teacher sits. Each meditator in darkness and closed eyes faces every other cell, but none can see. Alone together, each meditator is tuned by the pagoda's orbic vibe. When I return to sit in your dark cells, Dhammagiri, the agitated motion of my mind stills. I close the door and cross my legs, and now I wrap the shawl of truth around me and seek to realize, moment by moment, in the scintillation of my body's life, the reality of change upon change, the chemistry of life, the atomic kinetic base of incessant transformation in the particles of myself. Dhammagiri, I sit in your timeless, lightless pagoda meditation cells to find impermanence manifesting in every molecule of myself, and so to spring free of believing in that self, which I exchange for love and equanimity. When I wrote in Cultivating Inner Peace, when I visited the great Pali translator, Juan Mascaro, before his death, he was already very ill with Parkinson's disease, and he couldn't greet me as he wanted to. He was sick, crippled. And so when I walked in the door, this long-awaited meeting, both of us, we'd corresponded for many years, he put into my hands a copy of his translation of the Dhammapada. It's the Penguin translation by Juan Mascaro. And he pointed, read this. And this was his greeting to me. And so it's my conclusion to you about the spiritual emotions that go along with Vipassana. These words are the Buddha's words in the Dhammapada. Let us live in joy and love among those who hate. Among those who hate, let us live in love. Let us live in joy and peace among those who struggle. Among those who struggle, let us live in peace. Let us live in joy, although we have nothing. Let us live in joy like spirits of light.